All right, so thank you so much for being here, all of you. There are so many of you, that's very nice. So we are welcoming here Michele Mielly, who's here to talk about education in the US and multiculturalism. Indeed, you have always been active in the educational world. You're a professor here at GEM, and you teach intercultural management, ethics, international negotiations, and so many more subjects. Your career has led you to be a culture specialist, and you're quite sensitive to projects that give easier access to minorities. So far, you've worked to understand the dynamics at stake in the construction of the identity of a people through anthropology and sociology. Today, you joined us to reflect over the future of the US identity through multiculturalism in a context of nationalism. Thank you.
Thank you, Claire. Thank you very much. Yes, it's a pleasure to be here, and it's a pleasure to be part of the festival. Every year, it's wonderful to see what happens at GEM during this time, but also for me, this is a subject near and dear to my heart because we're talking about my country. So it's very important, but also necessary for us to think about it from nativist and non-nativist perspectives, and that's the privilege of being able to share with you. So I definitely hope that you all will feel free, if there's something that's not clear, to write down questions and share. I've got lots of questions for you that I'd like to throw to you to get some ideas from you, but please feel free at any time to interject. All right, so I'm going to talk to you about big topics, and I don't have a lot of time, so I want to be, I'll be efficient this morning. We're going to talk about the globalization of rage, or this kind of global anger we're witnessing, and we have been witnessing for decades now. The question of multiculturalism, diversity, and then the role of higher education in that mix. So it's a lot of topics, but we're going to look at someone who's really important and who is now becoming more famous and more well-known as time goes on, and it's a philosopher by the name of Richard Rorty. Some of you may have never heard of him. Some of you who have heard of him would be fans of his. So why don't we talk about Rorty? We're going to see why he's important to us in these questions that we're looking at today. So he did most of his work between the University of Chicago and Yale. He did a PhD in philosophy. He had a very long career. He ended at Stanford University. And he passed away in 2007, unfortunately, of pancreatic cancer. But up until the very last days of his life, he was giving radio interviews and was writing. And he identified himself early on as an analytic philosopher, so the school of philosophy that was opposed to continental philosophy that was happening in Europe, places like France, Germany, Spain, Italy. And so he was part of the kind of an Anglo-Saxon movement. But later in his career, he shifted because he was reading the 19th century works of philosophers. Can you hear me? Slow down. He was working in he was reading later in his career the works by John Dewey, William James, and Darwin. He was interested in pragmatic philosophy. And so as he moved forward, he started thinking about how philosophy could be politically useful, so also utilitarian in many ways. And so he started thinking, I'm just talking to a lot of other people, and we're all footnotes to Plato. I want something else. So he's written a lot of very famous, one of his most important books is Philosophy in the Mirror. His last book that was widely read was Contingency, Irony, and Solidarity as well. So he's well known for all of those works. Now, the book that we're going to look at today is a collection of essays called Achieving Our Country, Leftist Thought in the 20th Century. And Achieving Our Country came out 20 years ago. So interestingly, we have a 2-decade anniversary now. And this was looking at John Dewey's work again and Walt Whitman and trying to think about a new pragmatism, right? And he senses here that the American left was beginning to alienate the electorate, especially the academic elite. And he said that they're lacking alternative solutions. They're not offering solutions. They're bashing America. And he said, you know, I know patriotism has never been popular on the left, but it's a problem for us because we're losing traction with voters, right? And the right is becoming increasingly religious. whereas the left is becoming increasingly secular in the United States, and the academy has something to do about it, and philosophy should have something to do with that. So this is a quote that I'd like to share because I think it's important. It has gone around quite a bit in recent political analyses of the current administration, but it's interesting. He says, in 1998, members of labor unions and unorganized skilled workers will sooner or later realize that their government is not even trying to prevent wages from shrinking or sinking, or to prevent jobs from being exported. So this is the beginning of the offshoring problems that we now know so well. Around the same time, they'll realize that the suburban white-collared workers themselves, desperately afraid of being downsized, are not going to let themselves be taxed to provide social benefits for anyone else. At that point, something will crack. So here we're looking at an interesting idea, which is the people who traditionally supported workers were people on the left, people who supported labor unions, have stopped doing this. So in the 90s, this really was something very important that went along with economic prosperity that was happening through neoliberal policies and deregulation. The left started abandoning its base of workers, right? And at the same time, these workers were losing jobs, right? And so at that point, something will crack. The non-suburban electorate will decide that the system has failed and start looking for a strong man to vote for. Someone willing to assure them that once he is elected, the smug bureaucrats, the tricky lawyers, the overpaid bond salesmen, and postmodernist professors will no longer be calling the shots. So now this is interesting for us to think about. Rorty saw this happening already, right? So it's not a new phenomenon, what we see today, this populism that we see in the United States and in the world. But since the Enlightenment, we can see the origins of a question of identity that has been haunting us, which is we like this ideal type of international cosmopolitan identity that's shared by a democratic citizenry, right? Well, in the 1990s and in the 2000s, this debate was really raging in North America, and Europe was been trying to find a way to integrate immigrants, very basically, and our minority groups, right? If you want to call them minorities or people who simply have different origins. We've had this problem, and it's a practical problem that philosophy has not been able to deal with very well. So we have lots of thinkers during that period who were actually examining the ethical implications of multiculturalism, right? So I won't go through everything they said, but Martha Nussbaum is someone interesting because she really wrote a lot about cosmopolitan education. So this was really important to her to think, how can we embrace this humanity and this idea of loving what's different and what is strange, right? Understanding humanity in its stranger guises, which is not a new idea, but it's really something where she said we need to find a way to actually love the other. Another person who worked on this later was Anthony Appia at Princeton, and he worked on this idea of cosmopolitanism, which is from the Latin philosopher who was in Rome, Terence. So Terence's work we're going to look at, but it's really this idea of humanity itself, being sapiens, is enough for us to identify with one another. That's all we need. Everything else is social constructivism, basically. That's what we'll find out later, right? So if we think about this now, the past 2 decades, right? If we look back to Rorty, he said early on we're overlooking a disenfranchised middle class, and our economy is part of the problem, right? So he said we're really taking away the economic agency of the middle-class worker. Jobs are going away, automation is happening, and clearly they're losing their buying power. And this devastation of the middle class, I don't think we really, in the United States, were seeing what was happening from outside the academy, where I was at the time. And at the same time, we have these identity wars starting, right? So if you look at now what's happening, we have what's called hyperpolarization of the parties in the United States, a really huge bipartisan split. And that's an old problem. You can go back to the Civil War and see that. But what's interesting is that the intensity of hatred between these two parties has definitely changed. And that's something that we've seen measures of in political science, right? And that itself has led to a populist sentiment. And the anger today has gone global. So I think, interestingly, to think about how rage and anger have become something of a global phenomenon is really important. So I hope I'm speaking slow enough. Is that okay? Thank you. you know, a lot of academics there's a lot of anxiety in the academy about Trump, right? So it's very easy to Trump bash, and I think we have to resist that. And I think we have to think about these things in very logical and kind of historical terms, and see ourselves in our democracy as citizens who have to responsibility to not take the easy road here, right? Now, there's an interesting Indian journalist named Pankaj Mishra who's been looking at this idea of global rage and across the world. Being from India, he's seen a lot of this happening right there in his own country between the Hindus and the Muslims, and it's extremely virulent what's happening. And he points out that we're in this kind of angry and fearful age, but it's similar to something that was already seen in the United States and during the period of World War I by the Indian poet Tagore, who was there, and he said he saw this dense, poisonous atmosphere of worldwide suspicion, greed, and panic, and he found it extremely prevalent in the United States. So we can think today of like the jihadist movement, the radicalization of youth in various types of movements, these kind of epidemic of fake news, viral news, the way memes work, the way 4chan and the dark net and let's say hate speech debates. Right now in the United States on a lot of campuses there's a lot of debate between hate versus free speech and what constitutes free speech and hate speech. And so we're right in the middle of this right now, not only in the United States but all over. Now, when we think about identity and we think about identity politics, we have to keep thinking about multiculturalism, right? So we've already seen like this, you have a privilege if you're here, if you're educated, and if you're able to engage and in debate about identity. But a lot of people are not able to do that. And those who are not able to do that don't enjoy having the ideas that you have dictated to them, right? So this problem is that I think this idea of identity politics became, and political correctness in general, became something of an obsession in the academy as we started to see, based on the civil rights movements and the gains that we made in the United States for African Americans and the problems that have continued because of those gains, I think we saw that as the beginning of a broader, inclusive struggle to recognize groups who have been oppressed. But there's some problems with that, because one of the problems is it's fragmented people in the United States politically in extreme ways and radicalized people to become more religious, interestingly. And in that way, identity politics has really replaced debates on policy that are really important, like we can't afford housing. Your generation will not be able to buy the kind of houses your parents bought. Those are problems we need to be worried about. We need to be worried about how are you going to pay for education if you're in the United States, because it's really impossible. In fact, undergraduate education has been downgraded as a very poor investment in the United States because you don't get a return on it. It's so expensive in many cases, right? So we have real problems that we need to be looking at, and we're not looking at them, right? We need jobs quickly, and we need training, right? So I think the liberal left in the United States, myself included, we see ourselves as kind of part of the problem today, and we have to kind of look at that. I don't think we have to beat ourselves over on the back, but I think we need to say we're part of it. And in that way, we need to rethink a little bit the way forward and how we're going to be talking about identity politics, right? We need to think about this rage and this anger a little bit more, because we have some of it too right now, if you look at the way people are talking about people on the other side of the political spectrum. But if you just go back again to 1998, Rorty already knew this. So he says, one thing that is very likely to happen is that the gains made in the past 40 years by Black and brown Americans and by homosexuals will be wiped out. Jocular contempt for women will come back into fashion. The words nigger and kike will once again be heard in the workplace. All the sadism which the academic left has tried to make unacceptable to its students will come flooding back. All the resentment which badly educated Americans feel about having their manners dictated to them by college graduate will find an outlet. Okay, so I find that very interestingly prescient and important for us to think about again today. So Rorty's not the first person to think about this kind of anger that will come flooding back, this kind of movement. The floodgates will open, and people will finally be able to say what they've not been able to say, right? Someone else who thought about that was someone who lived through World War II, so a Jewish philosopher, German philosopher who fled Nazi Germany, a student of Martin Heidegger, Hannah Arendt. So some of you, I'm sure, have heard of her. And when she was observing, she was covering the Eichmann trials in Israel in 1963, and she was trying to understand, like so Hannah Arendt has largely been credited with the notion of crimes against humanity based on what she wrote after observing the Eichmann trials. And as she was thinking about this, she was trying to understand, what kind of historical subject could execute? Because Eichmann, at the end of the day, was following orders to organize trains to take Jews to the camps where they would be exterminated in the gas chambers. But he was organizing the transport. He was a logistician, basically. And he was just following orders. But what kind of historical subject can just follow orders? Well, she was wondering about the question of intentionality. What is your intention when you follow those orders? Do you think about your intention, or do you blindly and ignorantly follow orders? And I think that was a big question she had. Says, what are we banalizing? Are we banalizing non-thinking? And I think that was her real question. And I think that's a really more interesting question than banalizing acts of evil. It was banalizing the type of non-thinking that allows us then to commit crimes against humanity. And that in itself banalizes all kinds of bad behavior. And this is very much linked to the problems we have today, right, when we look at this globalization of rage. So things to think about. So I have some questions to think about here. So we've looked at Rorty, and we've looked at how Rorty in 1998 in Achieving Our Country already foresaw what was happening. And he links very nicely the idea of the academic left, which is mainly found on college campuses in the United States, and a very secular conceptualization of political activity. And he links this up to this problem of identity, right, and says, something's going to happen if we don't stop. And now what you find is that since then, Rorty was before social media and this viral nature of information that now we know, but I don't think he foresaw exactly what was going to happen if you think about not only the elections, but also if you think about the way that the parties have become even more divided because of social media. But maybe we can think about, we have to practically deal, so being pragmatic. I think Richard Rorty kind of reminds us, philosophy is also practicing thinking, but practicing policy. And so he says, if it doesn't serve a purpose, it's just talking. And so if we look at this problem, for example, real problems like this hyperpolarization of our electorate, which we see in France also, and we see in England, for example, right now. So we're observing this, how parties are not in families. It's very interesting. There's a lot of sociological studies of families breaking up, couples breaking up, siblings not talking to each other over the American elections. And the same is happening in England with Brexit. So it's really, these are very divisive issues that actually break up family structures. And so this polarization, I think, is something that we need to think about and be able to deal with and have some answers to, so that we don't take part in it. And it's not easy to not take part in that when we have strong passions, right? So we're really right now governed in these identity wars with a lot of emotion, right? So how are these questions of identity, whether it be culture or gender, we're looking at a lot right now, or political, playing out in universities and institutes of higher education? So I think we need to think about that. What's happening in our intellectual and ethical realms of thought as we are working towards either studies or scholarship or research, or we're just citizens interested in educating ourselves and arming ourselves better? What can we do differently, right? What kind of practical activities can we engage in? Right? How can we be thought leaders somehow? And I think a lot of us are doing a lot. And a lot of the people in this room, I'm sure, are taking part. But it's really important to kind of think about it, to ponder that, to question, query, where are you? And also to query, what is the nature of your work? Is there something in your work that could serve a different purpose, right? In the universities, are we sufficiently examining what Michele called this globalization of rage, right? Are we sufficiently thinking about our own polarization, our own biases, right? To not banalize our differences, misdeeds, or biases that prevent us from reaching across and talking to people who are different, right? And that's really, really hard because we're in echo chambers of similarity, and we hang around a pretty homogeneous group of people. So it's really hard to go out and talk to those who are different. It's uncomfortable. Puts us in a position way outside our comfort zone often to have to do that, and yet it's exactly what we need to be doing. And there's some really interesting initiatives out there. I would encourage you to look at a website called Better Angels. And Better Angels is a really interesting project that is being run in the United States to force conversations between rabid Democrats and angry Republicans. And they have very interesting ways of finding people and making them talk to each other by using social media. And it's working. It's quite interesting. So there are things we can do and look at, right? Now, if we look at American universal life, it's very rooted in this kind of cultural relativism, right, and political correctness. And it's something that there's ways of speaking there and here in the academy that are quite constricting, right? Restrictive. And I think we have to worry about that. How are we talking? Can we talk about others in a way that is natural, all right? Now, we can't continue this kind of political correct discourse because the way that it's been seen by the right is that it's a form of thought control. So what they've done is they've created, for example, lists of the most dangerous professors. Richard Rorty would have been #1 on the list of dangerous professors. So immediately, professors with ideas about political correctness or political ideas, or religious ideas, secular ideas, were put on lists that are on the web. You can actually type 10 most dangerous, 100 most dangerous professors in America, right? And so, because they've been seen as, and they've been depicted as actually being the real totalitarians, right? So you see a lot of memes where you'll see the left, people from the left who are looking retrofitted to look like Hitler, et cetera. So you're seeing a lot of that. And I think that problem is that these identity politics have done more to fragment us than to pull us together. And a lot of the writers who are looking at this are saying this, right? That the problem is fragmentation. The more we identify minority groups that have been oppressed and protect them, the more the need for further recognition ensues. So there's really not an end once we start. And the problem is then we get away, once again, from the issues that are really plaguing our society, which are economic in nature, right? Among others. Of course, there's also environmental. But I think the #1 problem we're looking at right now in the ideology of the populism that we're experiencing is linked to economic problems. And that's not surprising, right? So there are lots of questions on there. It's difficult to talk about cultural relativism because otherwise we go towards absolutism, and we need to find something in the middle of that continuum where we can have conversations and be comfortable saying things that are politically incorrect. I think it's okay. We need to give ourselves perhaps in the academy space where we can say things that are surprising, shocking, insensitive seeming, because otherwise we're not allowing people to have debates, and we're not armed ourselves to have debates when we walk outside the academy and we're dealing with a much broader diversity of people in the workplace and beyond. So let's just go, I'd like us to kind of look at a couple of more things that Richard Rorty said about the academy, and then we're going to open up for questions. You know, he said, if you start with students who aren't reasonably honest and decent by the time you hit the university, he says, I don't see there's much that we in higher education can do about it. If they're given, despite being honest and decent, to fornication and sodomy, that's none of the university's business. He didn't want to worry about the moral realm of what happens outside the university, right? But on the other hand, if students are uninterested in a couple of big topics for Rorty, like the quest for social justice, or if they're fundamentally selfish and have no interest in the relief of suffering in our society, then perhaps the university should be concerned. He goes on to say, I wouldn't trust the administration to handle this kind of thing, but maybe the faculty should say to itself, hey, we belong to a great moral tradition, the tradition of American progressivism, the tradition of the New Deal, civil rights movement, and we have been the moral leaders of the nation. We have, at our best, been the conscience. If we're not being the conscience of America anymore, perhaps we're doing something wrong. I don't, however, know what the faculty should say next. Suppose a faculty does reach a conclusion. What should it do? Perhaps nothing as a corporate body, but maybe as individuals, the professors could try to slip a few more appeals to pity and charity into their lectures. So he goes on to talk about what you can do in terms of those kind of appeals. But I think what he's trying to say is, if you don't create hope in the university for change or for some kind of positive action societally, especially in a business school, which is where we are today, where we are trying to instill the right kind of ethics into our future leaders, then what is the purpose? And so it's difficult as an entity, as a whole school, corporate-wise, to push forth as a university or any kind of institution of higher education one view of multiculturalism or identity or ethics. But I think we need the diversity of views, and I think we need our students to engage with these ideas. And I do think some students may not be interested in things like social justice, right? Or fundamental inequities of societies, or problems of minorities. You don't have to be interested in those things. But he's saying there's some fundamental principles of human decency that he ascribes to as a pragmatist, and that we should be thinking about today as we move forward. And I think if Rorty were with us now, he would be very interestingly engaging with us on these questions, and I think pushing us to identify our implicit biases and assumptions about the others who voted for Trump and those others who are our political opposites and who are seen as non-progressives, right? So no matter what side of the political spectrum you're on, I think he would say it's very important to engage. So in initiatives like Better Angels, or initiatives that are going to force the conversation to happen. All right, so I'm going to stop at that, and I'd like to open up for some other questions or comments to think about this. So I'm here and open to your questions, ideas. Yes?
I read recently the idea that we should be talking about adversaries and not enemies. Would you agree with that? Is that where we need to move towards?
Yeah, maybe the word would be opponents. So the question was, should we be thinking more about adversaries versus enemies? And I think that's a good question. What are the words we're going to use, right, for the others? And I think that it's true that we've become so entrenched in differences that it's very easy to see the other. I mean, this is really pre-Civil War conditions, right? We see this like if people who studied the Hutus and the Tutsis in Rwanda, you know, they lived next to each other in peace for a long time, and a lot of the surveys showed that they were okay. So what was interesting is authority figures on the radio made it okay to destroy the other. In fact, they called for it, right? So it was the Hutu power movement that made it okay. The permission structure changed. So the problem is, if our permission structure makes it okay to call people enemies and then to ridicule them, then it's okay then to go as far as something like a genocide. So I think we have to be careful the way we talk about the other. I think it's really important. I completely agree with that. So yes, so maybe we could say the opposition, or like we said, some kind of way of looking at the other that is absolutely entitled to their perspective, and at the same time someone who's worthy of debate, right? So we have to decide with whom we want to debate. There may be some people who truly are our enemies because we see them as evil, right? So I think we can draw lines. But I do think also that it's important to keep that, if the way we speak about the other, think about it this way. What you say, for example, on social media, imagine the person's in the room. Would you talk to them that way? And I think that's the big litmus test, is how are we talking about the other when we're engaging in debates? Are we talking just to other people who agree? And then we can use a specific language that we would not use if they were right there talking to us. Thank you. Yes.
Merci beaucoup pour cette conférence absolument.
Thank you for that very interesting conference. It's very rich. And I just wanted to ask you something. Is there a lot of... Are we hearing a lot in the United States? We're hearing a lot in France about what's happening. We're aware of what's happening. What's your reaction to what's happening in the United States? Should we be stopping this fragmentation, this permanent reduction that is really stirring things up? And it's annoying people. I know that in France we're only beginning to hear this. And another question is it not just a question of generation as well? People who teach in universities, for example, who teach this kind of discourse, often they're 50, 60 years old, if not more. I know some people who are very old who continue to teach and who say that Afro-Americans invented everything. And now when we see this kind of extreme attitude, I think it's... Is it not just a question of generation, therefore, with the media taking up these ideas as well? The name of the person, the first name, what was it? Bakoty. Bakoty is a Canadian. He has written on multiculturalism. You can have the references to his book. It's a book that I found very interesting. It really does call things into question. Yes, now Canadians... Well, Canada is rather specific, isn't it? But Canada is interesting when it comes to the United States. Even the right-wing people in Canada, they have to talk like left-wing people if they want to be elected. So it's very different. But just to come back to that question, perhaps we need to focus on the question with respect to Afro-Americans.
The question was really looking at how Canadians have looked at, the different Canadian thinkers have looked at multiculturalism from the Canadian side, but also this kind of problem between generations. So the question was, is this generational, the way that we're looking at multiculturalism? Of course it is, right? And people who lived through the civil rights movement are not going to have the same vision, or people who suffered because of the civil rights movement. So it depends on really how you see it. A lot of people say that United States, for example, everybody's always asking me, why are Americans so religious, right? One of the reasons why the right became a political force, the religious right became a political force, was because of desegregation in 1963, because of the civil rights gains. A lot of people felt they were not allowed anymore. And this is part of the problem, right, that we're talking about today. The permission structure did not allow them anymore to openly be racist or to openly discriminate. And it's very hard to change that overnight, especially in places in the South where it had always been a kind of an establishment that African Americans were inferior as a race, right, which is a concept that was invented, race. But at the same time, it's very hard to change that overnight. It's endemic in the population, and it's deep, deep bias. And so when we desegregated public schools, private, religious, conservative schools, biblical schools started cropping up in the United States who did not accept people of color. Because of that, the American government said, we take away your tax-free status. Now you have to pay taxes. You will not be a nonprofit organization that does not pay taxes if you don't accept minorities. And that, from the 70s onwards, began what we know now as this religious right movement that became political. They started organizing politically. And so those kind of things are generational. And I think people today are kind of, we have to go back and study the history of it, but people just don't know. So I think young people today are kind of like, I'd be interested in hearing what students have to say about this. A lot of students, they're like, I don't get some of the debates that you guys are into about homosexuals, about people of color. about all kinds of issues, whether it be gender orientation, sexual orientation, or minority groups in general. A lot of the young people are amazed by how this debate is raging among people of their parents' generation. So there's definitely a big difference, and I think we can't deny it, that there's just more mixing because of globalization. There's more international mobility, and mobility of ideas also goes along with that. And that has been a very positive offshoot of it. But the negative side is the people who are disenfranchised and not included in that process of globalization and the privilege of cosmopolitanism are the people that we need to worry about today and connect to. Yes, I hope I answered your question. Yes.
Thank you for your lecture. From my point of view, self-criticism of academics is something important indeed, but don't you believe there is a need to go deeper? I mean, in my mind, university should help to rebuild a society that is deeply split, deeply divided, and this is in my mind something to some extent much more important. I mean, just to help to rebuild a society as a community.
So I think what you're saying is that instead of worrying about what our past sins were, now we need to find a way to create community today. And I agree with that. I think one of the things that I see it's interesting, right? Because we see this happening more and more. Like the more you recognize diversity, the more you need to have like official holidays recognized, for example, for different minority groups. But you also need to recognize different types of people, like when you ask for gender, right? So I see that France has a very interesting approach to this, where France says it's egalitarianism.
This is a very French question, I'm sure.
I know, and I appreciate it. Because I think that France has interestingly skirted the issue by pushing egalitarianism. And in a way, I've been very critical of it on certain topics. When it came to the laws about the headscarf, the hijab, nijab, I found that very disturbing for many reasons. At the same time, France has been able to say it's because of egalitarianism. So holding that up as a kind of ideology or foundational dogma is important, because today France doesn't have to recognize all these diversities that other, let's say the Anglo-Saxon model has had to, right? So this goes back to Enlightenment, really, right? If we go back to this is where it all started, right? So we're all heirs of that period of this libertarianism and the recognition of difference and tolerance. So if you go back to Voltaire and Traité sur la tolérance, he admired England for its ability to integrate difference and to recognize difference. And he saw France as, of course, at the time, it was a very different France. It was not a secular France. But France's ability to, I believe, to move away from that problem is thanks to its ideology of egalitarianism. And I think in the university, it's a good thing. I think it's a very good thing. So I really do think it's a good problem and probably impossible for Americans to emulate, but a lot of people would like to. That also like to steal your healthcare system in the United States, but I don't know when that's going to happen. Any other questions? Yeah?
Yeah, I was wondering, thanks for the inspiring lecture, but I think the real question we need to ask ourselves as academics in American universities or French business schools is, to whom are we talking? We have, it seems, a very limited reach because of economic reasons, and how can we counterbalance a growing political populism that reaches the masses that we don't reach, since education has become so expensive and prohibitive to some people. So do we still have some hope to reach those people? How do we do that?
Yes. I mean, it's really a nice question, because it does, are we just talking in an echo chamber? And that's exactly what Rorty was concerned about. It's exactly what he said. He said, you know, and I think that's where the Stanford professor, I can't remember his name, who started the first MOOCs, that was his idea. He said, you know, I like it that I have 200 really smart students, but I talk to 200 students a year, and that's it. And I have more to say to more people than that. So I think one of the ideas would be then going toward these free, and I mean, and there are new models evolving of education because of the cost of the United States. You're seeing free universities evolve that are online and that are free. They're open source university education. I think there'll be a part of the population that will say we don't need a bachelor's to be smart and to be qualified. So that may be one of the answers. So technology and digital technology in general is pushing the envelope on questions like that, on this kind of select few that actually get to engage. I think part of it is also that there's, I mean, the natural elitism of the academy is that we promote our own, right? So there's a lot of homogeneity, even if it's cultural homogeneity, like a lot of different passports in a university, but they're all from the same demographic, right? Socioeconomically speaking. And I think that that's the real question, right? How do we go beyond that? And I think that's what Rorty wanted us to do. And he was very active in like labor unionizing, right? That's why he liked Karl Marx, and not necessarily for his ideas, but for his activity levels, right? He said at least Marx was engaged with workers. He was interested, right? And Engels was going and talking to, you know, he did all this field work in factories, right, in the UK in the 19th century. So I think that's the idea, is that academics in their research can, I mean, they can be very, very playful and at the same time very committed, right? So I think there's nothing wrong with intellectual pursuits not taking themselves too seriously, because not everybody's going to read them, but saying at my level I can do something that is proposing positive change, some kind of engagement that's political or that's ethical, right? But you're right. I think one of the only things we can do is try very much to also publish our ideas in places that will be read not only by academics. So it means going beyond academic publications alone, going beyond teaching just your students, and it means maybe doing community outreach and working with free universities, Université Interage, and those kind of things. I think there are things we can do very locally. Yes? Yes.
Vous avez parlé de Canada tout à l'heure.
You talked about Canada and its cursor, which is more to the left from a societal point of view. But it seems to me, but tell me, that the Amerindians' destiny cannot be envied, and it's even worse than what we have in the United States. It's not just the cursor, therefore, that is dictating things. There are other things that are deeper that need to be dealt with.
The question was about the condition of Native Canadian, Native Indians in Canada, and it is a very sad state. There's a lot of people working on this. I actually spoke to a lawyer who's working on representing people who were separated, children, just like in the Aboriginal cultures of Australia, children who were separated from their parents at birth and put into re-education centers to be, you know, raised in the Canadian way. So there's a lot of bad things that happen, and I think that this is part of our societies which are built on, I mean, the fundamental violence that created America, that created the Americas, is part of something that we carry with us. And that's why we all have programs of affirmative action, for example, or what we call positive discrimination in France. These are things linked to our original sins of our countries, of all of our nations, especially nations of immigrations that massively had to genocide in order just to exist, and then to resort to slavery and importing human, you know, basically human chattel in order to continue. And so Canada is different today. Canada is more European in terms of its influence than the United States. Canada looks a little bit more outward, but Canada has very similar problems based on its history, right? And we are two colonies. We're just different period. We're basically two very successful colonies of the British Commonwealth, if you look at it. And there is some continuity in terms of that, the spirit of the Commonwealth and imperialism in both countries. Yes? Question? Hi.
J'avais juste une question.
Yes, I have a question. What do you think about Roveridge, the former Labour Secretary for Bill Clinton? He said
System that works for the majority of us is to get organized and politically active. The money interests are doing what they do the best, making money. The rest of us need to do what we can do the best, use our voices, our vigor, our votes itself to change the rules.
Yeah, Robert Wright. Thank you. That's nice. I think he's right. We have to do something. But I kind of disagree that we're going to let the rich keep getting richer, and we're just going to have to keep doing our own thing because we're prevented from doing that too, right? So I know what he's saying, but it's out of context. But clearly, one of the problems of prosperity is that when we're in a prosperous period like we are today, we think always there'll be this kind of Keynesian trickle down of the riches to the less rich. So we think if we just reinvest the money made in these large corporations or in these banks and these hedge funds into the organization, we'll create more jobs. That's what Adam Smith wanted, right? That's what Adam Smith said. He said it's going to happen. But he repeated like a mantra, the dividends will be reinvested in the company. They won't be purchasing offshore account, going to Panama with the money. You know, Adam Smith never said that. He didn't say you're going to buy 10 Porsches with your money, right? He said you're going to reinvest your money to create more jobs for people. So I think that Reich, he's overlooking the problem of when we deregulate how the wealthy are behaving, things like lobbies pop up, and then we can't get rid of the Second Amendment in the United States because of it. And it's all because of money. So he's right and he's wrong. We have to organize, we have to continue, but we have to regulate in periods of prosperity especially. And that's the problem we're having today. Yes.
So on February 14th, there was like a shooting in Florida, and this one was not like anyone else. And we saw that students from Douglas High School began a new revolution in the United States, especially the girl Emma Gonzalez.
Yes.
And they say that it's because they had teachers that taught them how to deal with things like this. Mm-hmm. And how do you think the United States in general could change how education changes regulation, politics in general? Like, is there something to do?
Yeah, and I think Emma Gonzalez is right. It has to start really early. It should start in elementary school, right? Which is ideally that's what's happening. There's a kind of a divine mission of educators with children, I think, and that's where the big divisions come: is in what ideals and ethics are we going to educate them? The Florida children that are involved in this trauma are responding in a very interesting way. So I don't know what's going to happen. We thought it would, with the Sandy Hook massacre 4 years ago, that would already have happened. It was so horrendous. But there was a movement of denial. That's not happening with Florida, so that's interesting. There were actually people online denying Sandy Hook in Connecticut, saying it never happened. That's not happening now with Florida. I think we've hit a tipping point, and I don't think it's going to go away. I'll be very interested to see how educators can continue to lobby the government, because I think it's going to take a very long and intensified effort, and politicians are hoping that in 6 months it's finished, right? So I think the educators have a role to continue mounting pressure and showing their students the value of activism, but long-term efforts. Are we out of time? Are we okay still? Yeah? Yes? Any other questions? Yes? Are we good? Okay. Well, thank you very much. If anybody wants to talk, I'll be around. Thank you. Thanks for your participation. All right. Have a nice afternoon.